The idea of obsession rarely announces itself loudly. It hides behind restraint, professionalism, and carefully measured silence, revealing itself only through patterns that repeat over time. In this case, the pattern didn't involve public declarations or reckless behavior, but something far more unsettling. It was the inability to fully let go, even when every reason to do so already existed. For Jamie Dornan, image control has always been one of his strongest defenses. He built a reputation on discipline, boundaries, and a clear separation between work and private life. Yet there has always been one name that disrupted that balance in subtle but consistent ways. The disruption wasn't dramatic, but it was persistent enough to draw attention. Obsession is often misunderstood as intensity, but it's better defined as fixation without resolution. Unlike attraction, which fades, or chemistry, which belongs to context, obsession lingers across time and circumstance. It shows up in delayed reactions, selective silence, and emotional responses that don't align with the situation at hand. Those signs, taken individually, mean very little, but together they form a recognizable pattern. That pattern became clearer whenever Dakota Johnson re-entered the conversation, even indirectly. Questions involving her never received the same treatment as others. Responses slowed, language softened, and denial became strangely absent. In an industry where reflexive denial is standard, this deviation mattered. Observers began noticing how often Jamie chose restraint over closure. Instead of drawing firm lines, he allowed ambiguity to exist, even when it fueled speculation. That choice protected nuance, but it also protected fixation. Obsession doesn't require pursuit, it only requires refusal to end something emotionally. What made this fixation hidden was how carefully it was managed. There were no confessions, no visible longing, no public vulnerability. Everything remained contained within behavior, timing, and omission. That level of control suggests not a lack of feeling, but an effort to suppress something that feels dangerous if acknowledged. Another key sign was repetition. Over the years, similar scenarios produced similar reactions. Dakota's name resurfaced, and Jamie's responses shifted in predictable ways. Consistency over time is one of the clearest indicators of unresolved attachment. Psychologically, obsession thrives on avoidance. By never directly confronting the feeling, it's allowed to exist indefinitely. Denial would have forced resolution, while admission would have forced consequence. Silence, however, allows fixation to survive in a controlled state. Industry insiders often point out that the strongest attachments aren't always acted upon. They are managed, hidden, and carefully boxed away. In some cases, that management becomes more consuming than the attachment itself. The effort to suppress can create its own form of dependence. This is where the narrative shifted from rumor to exposure. Fans weren't responding to gossip, but to pattern recognition. They weren't claiming a secret relationship existed, but that an emotional thread never fully ended. That distinction made the story feel more credible. The word obsession unsettles because it implies loss of control, yet everything here appeared controlled on the surface. That contradiction is what made it compelling. Obsession doesn't always look chaotic, sometimes it looks like discipline taken too far. It looks like silence where clarity should be. What intensified scrutiny was how Jamie's reactions differed from his public persona. He is known for humor, deflection, and composure, yet those traits faded when this subject arose. Instead, caution replaced ease, and distance replaced dismissal. Those changes suggested internal negotiation rather than indifference. Fans began connecting moments across years, not to prove wrongdoing, but to map emotional continuity. Each instance alone could be explained away, but together they suggested something unresolved. Exposure didn't come from a leak, but from accumulation. When enough small signals align, they stop being coincidental. The danger of hidden obsession isn't scandal, but erosion. It slowly shapes decisions, boundaries, and reactions without ever being named. It doesn't destroy in one moment, but it alters behavior across many. That quiet influence is often more powerful than overt action. By the end of this first chapter, the story had moved beyond speculation about romance. It became a study of emotional avoidance and its consequences. Whether or not anything ever crossed a line mattered less than the fact that the line was never emotionally closed. What the audience was left with wasn't certainty, but recognition. Recognition that some connections don't end cleanly, and some feelings are managed rather than resolved. In that space between control and fixation, the idea of a hidden obsession began to feel less like exaggeration and more like an uncomfortable possibility. Once the pattern became visible, the conversation shifted from curiosity to consequence. Obsession, when exposed, doesn't remain abstract, it begins to affect real structures and relationships. What had once been managed privately now carried public weight, forcing choices that could no longer be delayed. The hidden nature of the fixation was no longer a shield, it had become a liability. For Jamie Dornan, this exposure created a new kind of pressure. It wasn't about proving innocence or denying rumors, but about reconciling internal truth with external expectation. The careful balancing act that had worked for years suddenly felt unstable. Once a pattern is named, even indirectly, it's difficult to pretend it doesn't exist. The emotional cost of long-term suppression often appears in unexpected ways. Increased distance, sudden changes in routine, and heightened caution are common responses when something private threatens to surface. These shifts don't signal guilt, but strain. Managing unresolved emotion requires constant vigilance, and vigilance eventually exhausts. What complicated the situation further was how the public framed Dakota Johnson within the narrative. She wasn't portrayed as an instigator, but as a focal point, the presence around which everything else reacted. In psychological terms, that makes her less a cause and more a trigger. Obsession doesn't require reciprocity to persist. This reframing altered how audiences interpreted past events. Neutral interactions took on new meaning, and ordinary restraint looked like concealment. The story didn't grow because of new information, but because old information was being reread through a different lens. Once that lens is applied, it's difficult to remove. Industry observers often note that exposure changes behavior even without direct accusation. When people feel seen, they adjust, sometimes overcorrecting in the process. Increased distance can look like avoidance, and silence can feel defensive, even when it's protective. The line between self-control and self-erasure becomes thin. Family dynamics are often the first place this tension manifests. Even when nothing tangible has occurred, the presence of an unresolved emotional attachment can destabilize trust. Obsession, when hidden, creates fractures not through action, but through absence. What isn't said or resolved becomes a space where doubt grows. Professionally, the fallout tends to be quieter but just as impactful. Choices become conservative, risks are avoided, and emotional expression is tightly regulated. The goal shifts from authenticity to containment. Over time, that shift reshapes how someone shows up in their work and public life. The most unsettling aspect of this exposure is that it doesn't demand resolution. Obsession, once identified, can persist even under scrutiny. In some cases, exposure simply forces it deeper underground, where it continues to influence behavior in subtler ways. Visibility doesn't always lead to closure. Public fascination thrives in this unresolved space. Audiences are drawn to stories without clear endings because they mirror real emotional experience. Not everything is confessed, denied, or concluded neatly. The discomfort of not knowing becomes part of the appeal. What remains after the initial shock is a recalibration of boundaries. Increased distance, stricter control, and emotional neutrality become tools of survival. These adjustments may protect external stability, but they rarely heal internal conflict. Healing requires confrontation, and confrontation carries risk. In the end, the story of a hidden obsession isn't about scandal or wrongdoing. It's about the long-term effects of avoidance and the cost of never fully closing an emotional chapter. Exposure doesn't create the obsession, it reveals it. And once revealed, even silence speaks louder than before. The lingering question is not whether the obsession existed, but whether it was ever addressed. In Hollywood, many stories end without answers, not because the truth is unknown, but because acknowledging it would change too much. Sometimes, the most revealing exposure is simply realizing how long something has been left unresolved.